I was the Regional Environmental Officer for the Department of the Interior, and in that role I coordinated the Department of Interior's response. And it was the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs involved, also the National Park Service, the Office of Aircraft Services, and USGS. And my role partly is to make sure that the Department of Interior is speaking with one voice when we have some difference of opinion on an issue, and also to resolve any conflicts and deal with the Coast Guard and all the other agencies. My prior background to this was I worked in environmental enforcement back in Maryland, back in the 70s. And in that time, I've probably been on 1,000 oil spills, 300 to 400 chemical spills. Certainly the oil spills weren't all this big. But it gave me the experience, and I was also able to communicate with the responders better than most people can, because I've been through all that. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the response, because after being on 1,000 of them, I've never been on any spill that was this unique. So with that, we'll get going. The ship, the New Carissa, grounded off the coast of Coos Bay on February 4th, 1999. It came into port. It was empty. It carried wood chips from Coos Bay to Japan. And it was coming back empty, so it was sitting real high. There was a big storm coming in. They were advised to stay under power out in the ocean. They instead came in and anchored. Anchor chain wasn't long enough. They didn't have an anchor watch. And the anchor watch is you sit there and look at the lights of Coos Bay, and if the lights of Coos Bay start moving, you're probably sure that it's your ship that's moving and not Coos Bay. And so they ran aground. One of the things that you do when you run aground like that is you power up and you go in toward and then turn. Well, this was a ship that didn't have enough power, and so it went hard aground. This is about where it was. There's the mouth of the Coos Bay. All this in here is the Bureau of Land Management land, except for the immediate beach area, which is state land. And up here was Forest Service land. So the access was through federal land, so we had BLM, or Forest Service law enforcement folks involved in keeping people out. This is just an indication of what this ship was being hit with every day. The waves, the storms that were rolling in there. We had salvage team come in these guys were from all over the world. They said, we've seen worse storms. We have never seen such a series of bad storms. So it was, at first, it was like every other day a storm would be rolling in up from the south. So this ship is sitting there, it's running aground, it's getting hit with waves like that just keeps pushing it in further and further. The salvage team couldn't get it off. Coast Guard couldn't get it off. And so it sat there, and they took everybody off the ship by helicopter. They put all the Coast Guard and all of the responders on by helicopter. The entire operation was done by air. Thousands of hours of flight time, helicopter time. And to watch these guys operate, they're just absolutely amazing. To fly in that weather and to do what they did without anyone getting hurt was just incredible. So we set up a command post at the Coast Guard Air Station. Now it's pretty commonplace. When you have a big event like this, you set up an incident command. And everybody knows their role, everybody's talking the same language. You got people from federal, state agencies, private sectors. They're all talking the same language. This was probably the first time in the Pacific Northwest that we had a true incident command. And if you were an incident command expert and you sat in there, it didn't look like a true incident command does now, but it was the first time we were able to pull it off, and it helped greatly with the communications. And that's the one thing that fails. No matter what you do, no matter how much you practice, it's always the communication that fails. You don't practice communication, you practice response. But you know, somebody saying, you might be saying the same things but in different ways. Each agency has their own language, and you know, and Clackamas Community College has all their language and acronyms. So that's the one thing that that this helps with. So on February 9th, the ship's started leaking oil. And it started leaking oil because it started to break apart. And this was the initial oiling. I mean, we're up the coast a ways. And initial oiling, you get something like this, and then later on, the oil starts to break up and comes in smaller amounts. So this just gives you an idea of the beach closest to where the ship was. And a lot of the debris, there's a lot of debris out there, and you had to clean all that up as well. And this gives you an idea of what it was like. We got a storm rolling in, we got guys on the beach, and it's all handwork. I've been doing this for 50 years. I've been on oil spills for 50 years. It, for the most part, has not changed. It's manual labor, some booming equipment, but there's no technology. I mean, you get out there with bulldozers and clean all that up, but then you're doing more harm to the environment than the oil is in a lot of cases. This is it's hard to see. It's an oil spill boom. It's on 10 Mile Creek, and I put that up there because for the new Carissa, it was probably the first spill that we had where we have an area contingency plan, and it designates areas for protection, and it prioritizes them so that you can get out in front of the spill. In this case, the oil spill boom is not to contain the oil, but to keep it out of the estuary. Now, in the old days, prior to this spill, you would come together, the natural resource folks would say, okay, we want this protected, and this protected. And the responders will say, well, we can do that. We don't have enough equipment for that. We can't do that. The biologist would say, well, you're working for the spiller. You don't want to spend the money, and there was all this mistrust. Because of that, we all sat down, we got everybody together, all the resource folks, and said, okay, without an oil spill, the priorities, just tell us what you want identified. And then the responders would sit there and go, we can do that, we can do that, we can't do that, the current's too strong, we don't have enough equipment. And there was a level of trust because it wasn't an emergency. So what we ended up with was a list of priorities, all mapped out, that you could do something about. And all the responders had this. And so they would respond without any direction and set up these booms without anybody telling them they have to do it. And so these things were getting done within hours, where before it would take days to get them out there. So that was one of the big improvements. Unfortunately, on a coast like that, there's not many things you can do. There's not many priority areas just because of the nature of the ocean. So as I said, there's the initial spill, and it spread out, and then it slowly starts breaking up. Wave action takes it, and you get a lot of things like this, little tar balls. And so you would have beach surveys. People would go out on the beach, they would survey, they would say, okay, we found oil here, here, and here. We would set up priorities in the command center, and then they would send out the responders the next day and say, okay, here's your priorities, here's where we want you to go. Again, hand labor, these guys would go out there. One of the things they did use are called pom-poms. And it looks like a cheerleader's pom-pom. And they're in strings, and you can set those in the surf zone, and oil will adhere to those. It's passive response. You're not affecting the environment too much, but by the same token, you're not getting a lot of oil, but you're getting some. But you can also see the size of the ship sitting out there. So we would send survey crews out. They go, okay, we found this beach, it's oiled, we want this as a priority. Storm would roll in, we'd send the responders out, and they go, there's not any oil out there. This happened like 3 or 4 times, and finally NOAA, I think it was NOAA that went out and did this, they dug a ditch. And there's the oil that was sitting on the beach a day before. It was under about 10 to 12 inches of sand from the storm. So this stuff was disappearing. Nobody knew where it went. It was getting buried. So you have something like that, you're just going to leave it because you're going to do a lot more harm to the environment by trying to clean that up. But it's There's some mistrust coming in. Well, the biologists are out there, they're saying this, there's oil, and we go out there and there's no oil. And that was why. And that happens a lot on the beach system like that, which makes it difficult to clean up. So, the oil's leaking from the ship. We sat down and thought, what's the best way of taking care of this? We decided to burn it on board the ship. And so you'll see, oh, sorry, wrong button. This is the second ignition. 2 days before, we were worried about the condition of the ship. And so they used very light explosives and not very much. We used Lumigel, which is essentially napalm, because we were afraid that if we did too much, the ship would break up. So we did it. It didn't burn the oil. The oil is the fuel oil for the ship. It's sitting below the cargo hold. It's sitting down in the water. And to use that oil, you have to heat it. And of course, it's run aground, the engines aren't running, it's not being heated, so it's pretty thick. So you need quite a bit of material to get it to burn. Yes.
How many gallons were you dealing with?
400,000 gallons.
Okay, I thought it was a lot.
All these are estimates.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
But it wasn't 20.
I have a slide at the end that talks about totals.
Okay.
And so we decided, to go out the next day. I had breakfast every morning at the Virginia Street Cafe, and I gathered all the interior folks for breakfast. 6 o'clock in the morning, one, to get the new people introduced to the people that are already there, get BLM folks introduced to Fish and Wildlife Service folks, get Fish and Wildlife Service folks introduced to Fish and Wildlife Service folks, and to find out what was going on. And to get these guys some food. Because you go on something like this in the emergency phase of a response, 17-hour days, you don't eat, and it's just not healthy after so many days. So I made sure they got at least one meal in them. Plus I got to find out what was going on and what they were doing and what they needed. But I also would get there a little early and sit with the Coast Guard strike team. And these are the guys that were on board the ship. I go, okay, what do you guys see out there? What's going on? So the morning before this, I sat down with the strike team and I said, what's going on? And they said, the ship's breaking up. He says, we're stepping over cracks in the deck to get to places. And he says, and that crack's getting bigger and bigger. So we decided we're gonna go in, we're gonna set the explosives, we're gonna burn the oil, and we're gonna use a lot of material. So they used, what I was told, 25-foot Bangalore torpedoes, which is, we had the Navy's experts in there, and that would blow the decking between the cargo holds and the fuel storage. And they used 4 55-gallon drums of Lumigel per tank. And it was quite the explosion. I was about 3 miles away, and you just felt it. And so this was the result. And later on that evening, this is what the ship looked like burning. I was standing next to the guy who took the photograph. He was with BLM. And you can't see it in this picture. There's a crack right there. And you'd stand there and a wave would come in, the crack would open, then it would close. Then it would open, and then it would close. And you see the glow there, but you see a dark spot there. And that decking didn't blow out. And so there's still oil in there. So the next morning, this is what it looked like. It came apart, stern sitting there, 2/3 of the bow out there. To get the oil to continue to burn, we brought in a helicopter with a helitorch on it, and he would drop napalm, Lumigel, down into the tanks. So all the Lumigel work was done by a guy from the Forest Service. They put him out in the far end of the Coast Guard Air Station, away from everybody, and he would mix up this Lumigel. Because they use it in firefighting. They set backfires. So we were utilizing the expertise of the firefighters BLM and Forest Service. And so we found the resources, we brought the helo torch in, all the fire guys got involved in that. This is debris staging area. I just put that in there just to show you just how much material is gathered in a response. And that's just one site. There's numerous sites out there. And there's cleaning stations, so you're not tracking oil back up into clean areas. So the one tank didn't burn. And so they wanted to try to pump out the oil that was in that remaining tank. So they cut a hole in the side of the tank. Obviously the storm wasn't coming in. We had nice weather, it was a low tide, you could walk out and touch the ship. And the stuff was just too thick. The guy from the strike team said it was like trying to pump Tootsie Roll. And there was no pumps that could do that. Since then, and because of this spill, pumps have been developed to pump things like that. When they thought they were going to pump it, we flew in what are called Baker tanks. And heavy lift helicopter brought them in. And these are heated tanks, so if you could get it to that tank, you could heat it up and you could pump it and put it in tank trucks or wherever to get it out. One of the big problems was this environment. The only road out there was a road like this that was constantly maintained by the Bureau of Land Management. It's a four-wheel drive vehicle. So you had to fly things in. You couldn't bring in anything heavy like this except by heavy lift. So they cleared out an area, and one of the things they had to do before they cleared it out was we had to get the archaeologists out there to clear it for cultural resources. So we had Park Service, BLM, Forest Service, we had Fish and Wildlife Service guys just out there to survey these areas. And I was standing out there when they were doing this, and there were probably 30-mile-an-hour winds. And this guy's dropping those tanks in there, and they were hardly moving. Very, very few had to be manhandled. Incredible operation. And at the same time, the Coast Guard's taking people on and off the vessel in the same kind of environment. So they set up the tanks, couldn't pump the oil, so they were eventually removed. So one of the things they wanted to do because of the remaining oil is tow the bow section out to sea and sink it. Out in the deep water, we thought that was the best way because the ship was going to eventually break up. The problem was there are 3 sandbars out there, and the tug could not get close enough to attach a tow rope. There was no tow rope in the United States that was long enough. So they flew this guy in from Norway, I believe. The Norwegians flew it to the East Coast, the Coast Guard flew it to the West Coast, and I have no idea how much that cost. It cost a lot. It cost a lot. So this was showing, we had BLM surveyors out there, and they were surveying, here's the stern, didn't move very much. They were surveying every day how much this bow section was moving. And it's moving this way. And it became critical that we towed it off, because if it moved behind the stern, they weren't going to be able to get it off. So there's the tug sitting out there. They attached the tow line to it February 26th. So, you know, we're into it by 3 weeks. And on March 1st, it got across the last sandbar. So it took that long, just a constant pulling of that ship to get them over the sandbars. And there it went out to sea, March 2nd. Going out to sea, there was discussion between the Coast Guard and the Navy as who was going to sink it. The Navy sent a destroyer up from San Francisco. The Coast Guard diverted a Coast Guard cutter with a 5-inch gun, and they wanted to sink it. So the Coast Guard was telling me this story. So they were telling, you know, we're having some arguments of who gets to sink it. Well, didn't matter. Because if you can see, the tops of these waves are being blown off. So I got out there that night. The tow line didn't break, but the connection to the ship broke. And it came back in. It came in faster than it went out. Because The winds were 100 miles an hour, the waves were 40 to 50 feet. And so, the next morning, there it is in Waldport. We went from Coos Bay to Waldport. You can see, if it had gone a little bit further north in the storm, it could have gone into the bay there. So, there it is. At this time, I left the scene to go up to Seattle. There was an international oil spill conference. How convenient. The national response team wanted a briefing. So myself and the Coast Guard went up there. We also briefed the regional response team, which was all our counterparts, on what was going on. And so we didn't need a new tow rope. We could get the tug closer. And so they were going to tow it back out to sea on March 9th. Well, there was a problem. Because of the publicity of this thing coming back in, the Navy didn't want to have anything to do with this. Coast Guard's cutter was up in Alaska. They diverted it, they sent it back to Alaska. So I'm there in Seattle, and the Coast Guard's telling me, we can't get anybody to sink this thing. And he says, we're having discussions, but. So the next morning, I saw the captain, and he said, we got an asset out of Bremerton going out there to sink it. I said, oh, great. They're sending a destroyer out there. So they get out to where they're sinking it in deep water. There's 400 pounds of explosives set in the bow of the ship. They ignite those, doesn't sink. So the destroyer fires 69 5-inch shells into the ship, and it's still not sinking. And I don't have any pictures, but what sunk it was a $1.4 million Mark 48 torpedo from a nuclear submarine. And that was the asset out of Bremerton he mentioned, but nobody had any idea there was a nuclear submarine out there. So it was a submarine that sank it. The Coast Guard strike team guy said, it probably would have sunk slowly. He says, but they got a torpedo. The captain of the submarine was interviewed, and he was so excited because he says, in my graduating class, I'll probably be the only one to ever fire a live torpedo.
What was keeping it so buoyant? Just air pockets?
Air pockets, so they sealed the back of it, because those compartments are separated and they're sealed. And so the breakage was in front of one, and so they went in there and sealed whatever leaks they could find. But I told the Navy, I said, you got to get these guys to design your ships for you. You can't sink it. So finally, we sank it with a nuclear submarine. Yeah.
Welders went in there and welded the crack shut?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was all temporary because they just want to tow it out to sea. I mean, the thing survived a storm that was 100 miles an hour winds and 40 to 50 foot waves and came back in and survived that. I mean, it's amazing. So one of the things that always used to be a battle in these oil spills was getting the spiller or the contractors or the Coast Guard or EPA to bring in wildlife rehab. In the old days, I would get a call from Fish and Wildlife Service and go, we got a lot of birds, we need a cleaning station. And one of the things I would do is try to find a facility that had enough hot water, enough area, enough room. You're in some remote locations sometimes, and it's hard to find. So we all sat down as part of the regional response team, and we worked with the cleanup contractors. You can see Clean Rivers was a big player. They funded this, and it's a mobile station for bird rescue. And a lot of times on spills, it was hard to get the Coast Guard or the EPA to bring it in. I went to the captain to ask him to bring this in. He says it's already on the way. That's how much the philosophy had changed. They recognized that this was part of the operation. So this is all part of the operations of spill response cleanup. So they have these stations, you have experts, you have veterinarians come in, you have people capturing birds, wild birds. These are trained people. Volunteers do not get to do this. If they do it, they'll get arrested. In the old days, everybody and their mother was out there on the beach trying to catch birds. There were certain groups that just wanted the pretty birds, as they say. People would take them home, put them in their bathtubs. So this is trained responders, a lot of law enforcement folks. So they take them to the rehab center. She's a veterinarian. All these people in there are trained responders. So 175 birds came into the bird cleaning station. 132 were released, and the remainder either died or were euthanized. And that's one of the things, it's like a hospital. They set up a triage. And you have a trained person going, you know, let's just put this bird out of its misery because we can't save it. So that's a pretty amazing number. So one of the things you have to do is you set up these tanks to let them recover the oils in their feathers. These are ocean birds. And it's a rough environment, and if they're not completely ready to go back out, you're just going to kill them. And so you let them, the oils start to reform and their oil glands recover, and you give them a while, and it's all lessons learned through experience. So that's a very high percentage. It's a much higher percentage than you normally get. We also had the snowy plover, endangered species. Snowy plover nesting areas were just south of where the ship came aground. Fortunately, most of the oil and the currents went north, but you can see, I like this. And I took this direct out of a report. There are 30 to 50 snowy plovers in the population. 31 were captured, so obviously there was more than 30. 31 were captured. Of those, 17 were oiled, and all 31 were released. The nesting success the next year was very high. So most of these birds survived. Now, part of that is the oiling they get is different. They're getting it mostly on their feet and their legs, a little bit on their feathers, versus the birds that are out in the water. They're getting a lot of oil on their feathers. But we also had the snowy plover restoration team right there, all local folks working on the snowy plover. To my knowledge, this was the only mammal that we got. And it wasn't captured. One of the responders took this picture and reported it, and by the time the folks got out there, it was back out in the ocean. So, but you can see a little bit of oiling, but felt well enough to go back out. And in all the analysis that was done and all the studies that were done, there were no marine mammals included in the natural resource damage assessment at the end. So they take the number of birds they have captured, and the biologists do their magic. Don't ask me what the formulas are or anything, but they came up with 1,085 dead seabirds. Of those, 26 of them were marbled murrelets, that were recovered. This is how many were recovered. 26 of them were marbled murrelets. And so we have law enforcement folks and trained biologists out there recovering dead birds. They're all individually bagged and tagged as to where they are, when they were recovered, and they all get sent to a morgue. So that many were recovered. They estimated that's how many seabirds died, and of those, 262 were murrelets, which is an endangered species. And the studies also estimate there were 672 shorebirds that died. So it goes to the morgue, bagged and tagged. You got people looking at them, see, you know, was it the oil that killed them, you know. So the numbers you get at the end are birds that were killed by the oil, and then the estimates are based on that. Some, just because of the environment they're in, die and come washing the shore, so they separate those out. But there's law enforcement folks there. It's chain of custody. You're preparing for a lawsuit and you're preparing to go to court. There's freezers. Everything is put in freezers and saved for years and years. So what they do with that information is, in the old days, you have an oil spill, you go out, you clean it up, you're done. See you later. It was nice. We had bulldozers down on the beach scraping everything up. And nobody really did anything about the wildlife and the natural resources. 1987, the Department of Interior passed damage assessment regulations, which designated natural resource trustees and provided them an avenue to do a damage assessment where you go in and you take all those numbers and you come up with a restoration plan to restore those resources. And so in this case, the trustees were Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, State of Oregon, Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpquen, Siuslaw Indians, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz. And so the department's natural resource damage assessment regulations didn't do a very good job with oil spills. And in 1990, after Exxon Valdez, the Oil Pollution Act came into being, and they designated NOAA to develop specific damage assessment regulations for oil spills. So what they did was they kept the same list of natural resource trustees, and they developed regulations that improved on the Department of Interior's. So one of the things you get to do, if you can, is the natural resource damage assessment process is really a legal process. You're preparing to go to court. You're hoping you can settle, but it's all a legal process. And it takes a long time. And it's not doing the resources any good. I was sitting in the command post, and the damage assessment contractor for the spiller came up to me, and they said, people I knew. And they said, we have this heavy equipment out there. We're getting ready to decommission it and send it home. Is there anything we can do with that for natural resources? So I got all the snowy plover people right there, and I said, right there, talk to them. So they got the heavy equipment out there. There's all the sand dunes out there. The sand dunes are created by Florida beach grass, which is an invasive species. And snowy plover is like nice flat level ground. So they went out there with this heavy equipment, directed by the snowy plover team, and cleared out this large area for nesting habitat. And so this was something that was done while we were still responding to the oil spill. But it provided habitat for the snowy plover so you could start the recovery process early. You enter into a formal agreement. If you know the people, you do it on a handshake, you get them going, and then you do all the paperwork later. I eventually signed this agreement on behalf of the Department of Interior. And in it, it says, and I didn't know this until I looked it up, and I signed it, that there was going to be no habitat creation as part of emergency restoration. Well, we'd already done it. So I think they were looking at maybe no more additional. We're not going to let you bring the equipment back in. But I signed it, and I don't remember that being in there. And so part of it is you eventually come up with a restoration plan, and you want the spiller to fund it. And so for snowy plovers, part of the emergency plan, and most of it was for the overall long-term plan. So habitat creation, maintenance of dune habitat for 30 years, which I thought sounded like a lot, and realized that expires in 4 years. Recruit and train volunteers to monitor public education, letting them know they're there, and control your recreation. Increase law enforcement and predator control, mainly foxes, I guess. Wetlands restoration, $1 million of the total sediment was diverted to, it was an old dike farmland that was obtained, and they were going to breach it and create tidal wetlands. So part of that was part of the settlement for New Carissa, and I'll get into overall numbers here in a bit, went to that project. The land became part of the abandoned Marsh National Wildlife Refuge. When you do restoration, you want the species that were impacted to be restored, and you want to try to do it as close as possible to where the incident happened. Not always possible. This was the closest and probably the best thing we could have done with that money. So you had shorebirds, waterfowl, raptors would all benefit from that, cutthroat trout, and salmon. And this was the land that became part of the refuge. The Nihilist-Tun Unit. That's a tribal name for the Coquille tribe named it. And this is when they breached the dike. I was there, I was invited to the dedication, and I was standing there with a bunch of tribal members, and they had this traditional canoe with the chief in there and some of the tribal members going through that breach. Because these were traditional hunting and gathering areas for the Coquille tribe. And I looked around, and all the tribal members had tears in their eyes. It was very moving. And that's about the only picture I have of that marsh. But that's a great picture. It shows you one of the reasons we do these things. So the marble murrelet restoration, 262. Marble murrelets nest in old growth forests. There's not a lot of old growth forests remaining on the coast of Oregon. The restoration team found a company that owned old growth habitat. And so they acquired that habitat for $15 million, I believe it was, close to it. The money, some of that money came from the spiller, and the rest of it came from the Coast Guard Oil Pollution Act fund people. And I should have done this earlier, but the Oil Pollution Act was developed in 1990 after the Exxon Valdez to provide a pot of money to use for response. Before that, during the Exxon Valdez and before, there was the 311K fund. And I tried to access that through the Coast Guard on a spill back in the late 80s. There was $6,000 in it, and that was it. That would have paid for maybe me for a couple of days on scene, not accounting all the response equipment. So they created the Oil Pollution Act in 1990. It taxed oil and set up a fund for response and for natural resource damage assessment. The fund also increased the penalties of the spillers. It included regulations like double hold tanks and has had a big impact. The spillers have a limit of liability based on the ship, but you lose your limit of liability if there's criminal negligence. And there was criminal negligence in this case. However, I talked to the Department of Justice, and they said, we're not going to pursue criminal negligence because there were emails between the Coast Guard talking about maybe their responsibility on having that ship anchor out there. Where it anchored was not marked clearly in the maps. It was actually a dredge spoil area by the Corps of Engineers. And he says, I don't think we'd win it. He says, so we're not going to pursue it. So they eventually pitched in like $4 million to the Natural Resource Damage Assessment. The rest of it came from this oil spill fund, from the Coast Guard. And you have to go through all these steps. It was a real battle. I got involved in negotiating the funding. I didn't get involved in the damage assessment process later on. So you have to go through, there's due diligence, there's review, but it's all still relatively new stuff. So they took about $15 million, they acquired a property. A third of it, roughly, these are rough numbers, was old growth forest. So habitat that was ready to go. A third of it was older lumber, but not old growth. So it was going to be managed to generate funds. Well, the third of it was going to be managed to become old growth forest. And a third of it was going to be used commercially to generate funds to manage all this process, to pay taxes. The land was turned over to the Confederated Tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians because they could pay taxes. The Department of Interior, Department of Commerce took this land, we don't pay taxes. And that was a big concern of Lincoln County. And so all this was coordinated with the locals. And so money is generated through logging. All this has to be approved by all the trustees. The plan the tribe came up with was excellent. It's ongoing. The county gets their money. Money goes back into the management of this. I wish I had numbers to tell you how successful it is. I don't. Most of the folks I know that worked on this are, like me, retired. But I know it's been fairly successful. I just don't have the numbers for it. Recreation. One of the things that happened was we shut access to the beach. Now it's winter time. I don't know how many people go out there, but people go out. There was a lot of irate people at the law enforcement folks because they weren't allowed to go down to the beach. So part of that was the numbers were generated and funds were provided for recreation improvements, recreation restoration. And that included trail maintenance and rehabilitation, paving some of the parking areas. For the most part, you're parking in sandy areas out there. Beach signage, maintenance and development of trails. So total restoration costs, $25.6 million. Again, $4 million from the spiller, the rest of it from the oil spill fund, which again is taxes on oil. The Marble Inlet acquisition, Snow Plover habitat creation, salt marsh restoration, and the recreation improvements. At the time, this was the largest funded restoration project from an oil spill in the United States. Might still be. So in a separate settlement with the state, the governor was insistent that they remove the stern. And so they had a salvage out company come in, set up this called a jack-up barge. And it had these winches on it, and essentially just pulled this thing apart. They had some welders down there cutting some stuff, but that's a rough environment, so they weren't down there a lot, and this thing just pulled this thing apart, pulling out huge chunks. And that was a completely separate $8 million settlement with the state of Oregon. We didn't have anything to do with that other than concern for oil being released as they remove that stern if there's any oil trapped. There was a little bit, but not much. So in total, these are estimates. 400,000 gallons of fuel oil on board the ship. 70 to 140,000 gallons were spilled. I'd say it's closer to the 70. 165,000 to 255,000 gallons were burned, and 60 to 130,000 gallons sank with the ship. I would say it's closer to the 60,000 number. We thought at the time this was going on, we thought it was about 40,000. So if you took halfway in between all those numbers, and it comes up to about 400,000 gallons.